The year is 1941. The world is on fire, but in the heart of the American industrial belt, the smoke feels distant. In a city built on the back of iron and coal, the city of Oakhaven life followed a predictable, rhythmic grind. Then, on a Tuesday in October, 2 months before the events at Pearl Harbor would change the world forever, a mundane municipal order was filed. It was labeled Civic Protocol 7. It wasn't a military decree. It wasn't an executive order from Washington. It was a local administrative adjustment. According to the city's public works records, Protocol 7 was a precautionary logistical realignment intended to safeguard the families of industrial workers during a time of global instability. The paperwork was dry. It spoke of zoning, utility management, and civil defense drills. But the physical reality was anything but mundane. Within 48 hours of the protocol's filing, the city's east side, a dense, vibrant neighborhood housing exactly 6,000 families, was effectively severed from the rest of the municipality. Iron gates were erected at the main thoroughfares. Public transportation lines were rerouted. Phone lines into the district were temporarily suspended for maintenance. But that wasn't the strangest part. Despite the sudden and total isolation of nearly 30,000 people, there is no record of a protest. There are no frantic letters to the editor in the local paper. There are no police reports of unrest. The 6,000 families simply stepped behind the line, and the city went quiet. To modern historians, the absolute compliance of the Oakhaven citizens is the most baffling aspect of the 1941 protocol. Even in the heightened anxiety of the pre-war era, the total surrender of movement and communication usually triggers at least a murmur of dissent. Records suggest that the families were not taken by force. There were no trucks, no soldiers, and no sirens. Instead, surviving documents from the Oakhaven Department of Health indicate that each household received a personalized letter on Monday evening. The content of that letter remains one of the great missing pieces of this historical puzzle. Only one fragment of a Protocol 7 letter is known to exist today, recovered from a safe deposit box that was opened in 1994. It is typed on official city letterhead, but the text is strangely oblique. It mentions the civic duty of the threshold and the necessity of the quiet period. It promises that all essential needs will be met through the internal supply chain. What happened next remains unclear. For the next 8 weeks, the east side became a black hole in the city's geography. Deliveries of food and medicine were made by unmarked municipal trucks. The drivers were sworn to silence under the Oaths of Industrial Secrecy Act of 1940. When they returned from the district, their vehicles were reportedly sprayed down with a chemical solution, though no official health crisis had been declared. And that's when things began to shift. While the rest of the country was bracing for a war on 2 fronts, the people of Oakhaven seemed to be focused on a very different kind of struggle, one that was purely administrative and entirely internal. Some historians believe that Civic Protocol 7 was a localized experiment in social management, a precursor to the more aggressive containment strategies that would be used later in the decade. Others suggest it was a response to an undisclosed industrial accident at the nearby chemical plant, a quiet quarantine designed to prevent panic while the city assessed the damage. There is no clear consensus, but the physical evidence left behind in the east side suggests a much deeper level of preparation. In the late 1980s, when the neighborhood was being demolished to make way for a modern highway, construction crews uncovered a series of subterranean conduits that had been installed in late 1941. These weren't standard water or gas lines. They were heavy-duty, lead-lined pipes that led from the city's main water treatment facility directly into the isolated district, bypassing all other neighborhoods. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. The conduits weren't empty. They were filled with a crystalline residue that, when analyzed by university chemists, revealed trace amounts of a sedative compound, a chemical often used in the 1940s to treat hysteria and anxiety in psychiatric wards. If the city was pumping mild sedatives into the water supply of 6,000 families, it would explain the lack of protest. It would explain the eerie, compliant silence of 30,000 people. But it doesn't explain why. By November 1941, the isolation of the east side had reached its peak. The district was self-contained, a miniature city within a city, operating under a set of rules that existed nowhere else in America. Personal stories from this period are rare, as many of the residents eventually moved away or passed on, but a few oral histories were recorded by a local university in the 1970s. One woman, Elena Vance, who was 12 years old at the time of the protocol, described the atmosphere as dreamlike. She recalled that her parents never seemed worried. They didn't talk about the gates or the trucks. They simply followed the schedule posted on their front door each morning. The schedule dictated when they could eat, when they should sleep, and when they were required to gather in their living rooms for civic listening hours. According to Vance, the listening hours involved a special radio frequency that played nothing but a low, rhythmic hum, punctuated by the voice of a man reading a series of numbers and names. "We weren't scared," Vance told the interviewer. "We were just waiting. We felt like we were part of something very important, even if we didn't know what it was." But the importance of Protocol 7 remains locked in the vaults of the Oakhaven Municipal Archives, where the files for 1941 are still listed as restricted for reasons of public welfare. The turning point came on the 6th of December, 1941. The protocol had been in place for 60 days. The 6,000 families had been isolated from the world, their movements tracked, their water treated, and their minds focused on a rhythmic hum. Then, without warning, the order was given to terminate. It wasn't a gradual reopening. It was a frantic, overnight dismantling of the entire apparatus. The gates were torn down. The trucks were burned in a quarry outside of town. The schedules were collected from every doorstep by teams of men in grey suits. The 6,000 families were told that the precautionary drill was over and that they were to return to their normal lives immediately. The next morning, December 7, the world changed at Pearl Harbor. In the chaos of the national mobilization, the strange 2-month isolation of Oakhaven's east side was forgotten. It was a footnote in a local history that was suddenly eclipsed by a global catastrophe. But for the families who lived through it, the protocol didn't end on December 6. It merely changed form. In the years following the war, Oakhaven returned to its industrial roots, seemingly eager to bury the memory of the protocol beneath the soot of its steel mills. But for those who looked closely at the city's post-war statistics, a pattern began to emerge, a series of statistical anomalies that suggested the 6,000 families had been permanently altered by their 2-month isolation. When the 1950 census was conducted, a discrepancy appeared that defied the laws of probability. In every other district of Oakhaven, the population fluctuated with the return of veterans and the shifting economy. But in the east side, the population remained almost perfectly static. Of the 6,000 families documented in 1941, over 95% were still living in the exact same residences 9 years later. In an era of unprecedented American mobility, this level of geographic stasis was unheard of. It was as if a physical or psychological tether had been lashed to the neighborhood during those 60 days in 1941, preventing the residents from drifting away. But the most jarring detail emerged when researchers began cross-referencing the East Side's draft records from the Second World War. Oakhaven was a patriotic city. Thousands of young men from the West Side and the suburban fringes had enlisted or were drafted within weeks of the Pearl Harbor attack. Yet, for the East Side, the neighborhood that had just undergone Protocol 7, the enlistment numbers were virtually non-existent. Records suggest that when the local draft board attempted to process the eligible men from the East Side, they were met with a series of automatic deferments issued by a federal authority that was never clearly identified. The men were listed as essential workers of Category Alpha, a designation that appeared in no other industrial city in the United States. But it wasn't just a lack of mobilization, it was a total exclusion from the most documented event in human history. These men didn't go to Europe. They didn't go to the Pacific. They stayed in Oakhaven, working in the same factories they had always worked in, under the same civic supervision that had been established during the protocol. Some historians believe the 6,000 families were part of a human reserve, a controlled population kept in a state of hyper-readiness for an industrial project so sensitive it required total domestic stability. What that project was remains a subject of intense speculation. Oakhaven's primary industry was the production of high-grade industrial lubricants and chemical stabilizers. While vital to the war effort, it was hardly the kind of work that would justify the total isolation of 30,000 people. However, in 2002, a retired engineer named Thomas Miller, the son of one of the men who worked the Oakhaven mills, released a collection of his father's personal papers. Among them was a set of technical readouts from late 1941. The readouts didn't describe chemical formulas or steel yields. They described acoustic frequencies. Miller's father had been tasked with installing vibrational dampers into the foundations of the East Side tenements during the protocol. According to the notes, These dampers were designed to resonate at the exact same frequency as the low, rhythmic hum played during the Civic listening hours. And that's when they realized the listening hours weren't just for the families, they were for the houses themselves. The theory suggests that Protocol 7 was an experiment in large-scale structural resonance. By vibrating the buildings at a specific, low-level frequency for 60 days, the authorities may have been attempting to tune the environment, creating a physical space that influenced the neurological state of everyone inside it. This would explain the dreamlike state described by Elena Vance. It would explain why the residents felt a profound sense of importance and calm while being locked behind iron gates. But it doesn't explain what happened to the people who tried to disrupt the resonance. In the 1941 municipal court records, there is a single, overlooked entry from October 28th. It concerns a man named Arthur Gable, a shopkeeper in the East Side who was arrested for unauthorized sound emission. Gable had reportedly set up a loudspeaker in his window and played jazz music at full volume for 3 hours, attempting to drown out the rhythmic hum of the protocol. What happened next remains unclear. Gable was taken into custody by the grey-suited men who managed the supply trucks. He was never processed through the city jail. He never appeared before a judge. According to census records, Arthur Gable simply ceased to exist on the 29th of October 1941. His shop was boarded up, and within 24 hours, the neighbors reported that the vibration in that specific building had intensified until the windows rattled in their frames. This escalation of control suggests that the protocol wasn't just about isolation, it was about total environmental synchronization. The 6,000 families weren't just neighbors. They were becoming a single, cohesive unit, vibrating in time with a signal that was being broadcast from a source they could not see. As the war progressed, the East Side remained a strange, silent island. While the rest of Oakhaven celebrated the victories at Midway and Normandy with parades and headlines, the East Side remained curiously detached. A local journalist, Peter Sterling, attempted to write an exposé on the Silent District in 1943. He spent a week observing the gates, which had been replaced by security checkpoints staffed by private industrial guards. Sterling noted that the people of the East Side moved with a peculiar, synchronized grace. He described watching a shift change at the factory where hundreds of men walked in perfect, silent unison, their footsteps hitting the pavement at the exact same moment, creating a sound like a single, massive heartbeat. Sterling's article was never published. The newspaper's publisher was visited by representatives from the Department of War, and the draft was burned. Sterling himself was drafted 3 weeks later and sent to a remote weather station in the Aleutian Islands, where he remained until 1946. By the time the war ended and the Category Alpha deferments were lifted, the 6,000 families had been living under the influence of the Oakhaven frequency for 4 years. The 60-day protocol of 1941 had laid the foundation for a permanent state of being. But when the listening hours finally stopped in 1945, the reaction wasn't one of relief. According to medical records from the Oakhaven General Hospital, the East Side experienced a massive, localized health crisis in the autumn of 1945. Thousands of residents reported symptoms of extreme sensory overload. They couldn't stand the sound of birds chirping. They couldn't stand the chaotic noise of traffic or the unpredictable rhythm of rain. For 4 years, their world had been tuned to a single, perfect hum. Without it, the normal world felt like an assault. Some historians believe this was the true purpose of Protocol 7, to see if a population could be rewired to function only within a controlled artificial environment. But the most haunting evidence wouldn't be discovered for another 50 years. In the late 1990s, a team of archaeologists from the State University began a salvage dig on the site of the old East Side schoolhouse, which had been demolished decades earlier. As they excavated the basement level, they found a room that had been sealed with thick, industrial-grade lead plating. Inside the room was a massive, hand-cranked phonograph and a crate of black, unlabeled discs. When the researchers played the discs on a period-accurate machine, they didn't hear music, they didn't hear numbers. They heard the recorded voices of the 6,000 families, thousands of individual whispers layered over one another in a terrifying, chaotic wall of sound. Each voice was reciting a different set of coordinates, a different date, and a different name. And that's when they realized the listening hours hadn't just been about broadcasting a signal, they had been about recording a response. The discovery of the lead-lined room and the crates of black discs changed the trajectory of the Oakhaven investigation. It was no longer a story about isolation, it was a story about data. When digital restoration experts at the State University began to isolate the individual voices from the chaotic wall of sound, they found that the residents weren't merely reciting names and coordinates, they were participating in a massive, synchronized verbal ledger. Each family had been assigned a specific block of time during the listening hours to speak into the ventilation ducts of their homes, which researchers now believe were connected to a sophisticated pneumatic acoustic system that funneled the sound directly into the lead-lined basement of the schoolhouse. But the content of these recordings is where the timeline of Protocol 7 becomes truly unsettling. Records suggest that many of the coordinates being recited by the 6,000 families in late 1941 didn't correspond to local landmarks or even American geography. Instead, they mapped out specific, high-altitude locations in the North Atlantic and the South Pacific areas that would become critical battlegrounds in the years to follow. Even more baffling was the chronological aspect. Some of the dates being whispered by the residents in October 1941 referred to events that would not occur until 1943, 1944, and beyond. But that wasn't the strangest part. When the researchers cross-referenced the names being recited, they didn't find the names of soldiers or politicians. They found the names of children who had not yet been born, children of the 6,000 families who would eventually be delivered in the post-war years. What happened next remains unclear. Some historians believe the Oakhaven frequency wasn't just a sedative or a tuning fork for the environment, but a primitive attempt at a psychological predictive model. By isolating a large, controlled population and subjecting them to specific vibrational stimuli, the architects of Protocol 7 may have been trying to tap into a collective unconscious or a social resonant field that could anticipate future logistical needs. There is no clear consensus on whether the experiment was successful. What is documented, however, is the systematic physical erasure of the East Side that began in the mid-1960s. Under the guise of the Federal Aid Highway Act, the city of Oakhaven received a massive, disproportionate grant to construct an interstate interchange directly through the heart of the old East Side. It wasn't the most efficient route. In fact, engineers at the time noted that the path required the demolition of thousands of perfectly sound historic structures while leaving vacant industrial land just half a mile away completely untouched. But the city insisted. The demolition wasn't just about making way for progress, it was about the foundations. As the wrecking balls swung through the tenements where the 6,000 families had once lived, the city's Public Works Department oversaw the removal of the vibrational dampers Thomas Miller's father had installed. According to eyewitness accounts from the construction crews, the dampers were not simply dug up. They were neutralized with specialized chemical agents and hauled away in lead-shielded containers under the cover of night. And that's when things began to shift. As the physical neighborhood was pulverized and paved over, the paper trail followed suit. In 1968, a fire broke out in the annex of the Oakhaven Municipal Archive. The fire was small, localized, and quickly extinguished. But when the smoke cleared, it was discovered that the only documents lost in the blaze were the specific health records and utility maps of the East Side from 1890 to 1945. The protocol, the 6,000 families, and the 2 months of silence were being scrubbed from the earth. Evidence layers suggest that this wasn't just a local cover-up. In the 1990s, when the Freedom of Information Act allowed for a deeper search of federal records, a researcher discovered a debit entry in a 1942 War Department ledger. It was for a project titled the Oakhaven Baseline. The funding was not for munitions or steel, but for acoustic sociology and predictive demographics. The project was listed as active, non-terminal, meaning it had no scheduled end date. Today, the 6,000 families are gone. Most of the original residents who lived through the 1941 protocol have passed away. But their descendants, the protocol children, carry a strange and documented legacy. A 2012 longitudinal study, conducted by a private medical foundation which chose to remain anonymous, tracked the health outcomes of individuals born to families who lived in the East Side during the isolation. The results were statistically impossible. The descendants of those 6,000 families showed a near-zero incidence of certain neurological disorders, such as schizophrenia or chronic anxiety. However, they also exhibited a profound shared sensory trait, an abnormally high sensitivity to low-frequency sounds. Many of them reported that they could feel the approach of a storm hours before it arrived, or that they were plagued by a persistent, rhythmic hum that no one else could hear. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Using modern acoustic mapping, Researchers recently analyzed the ambient soundscape of the Oakhaven interchange, the highway that now sits where the east side once stood. They found that the structural design of the overpasses and the concrete sound barriers creates a natural resonant chamber. When traffic moves at a specific speed, the wind and the vibration of the tires produce a low, rhythmic hum. It is the exact same frequency as the Oakhaven frequency from 1941. Some historians believe the protocol never ended. They argue that the physical neighborhood was replaced by a more permanent, more subtle infrastructure. The 6,000 families were dispersed, but the tuning of the environment remained, now integrated into the very fabric of the city's movement. There is no clear consensus on why the city of Oakhaven would continue such a legacy. Perhaps it was a matter of bureaucratic momentum, a protocol that became so deeply embedded in the civic code that no one knew how to turn it off. Or perhaps, as some suggest, the 1941 experiment was merely the first phase of a much larger, much longer quiet period that we are all still living through. As we look back at the black and white photographs of the iron gates and the grey-suited men, the silence of Oakhaven feels less like a mystery and more like a warning. A warning about the ease with which a population can be isolated, synchronized, and eventually erased. The records suggest that the 6,000 families didn't question Protocol 7 because, by the time the gates were closed, they had already been taught to listen to the hum. Today, Oakhaven is a city like any other, defined by its traffic, its industry, and its noise. But beneath the pavement, and in the blood of the families who stayed, the protocol remains. The documents are burned. The houses are gone. The voices on the black discs are scattered. But the frequency is still there, vibrating in the foundations, waiting for the next Tuesday in October when the gates might close again. What happened in 1941 was not a failure of democracy or a lapse in judgment. It was a demonstration of a new kind of power, one that doesn't need soldiers or sirens to maintain order. It only needs the quiet. And as the sun sets over the Oakhaven interchange and the cars begin their rhythmic crawl home, the sound of the city begins to change. If you stand in the right spot, where the East Side Schoolhouse once stood, and you listen past the wind and the engines, you might hear it. A dull, rhythmic thud. A pulse in the earth, a protocol that is still, 80 years later, waiting for its final command. The story of the 6,000 families remains open-ended, a shadow in the history of a nation that was too busy fighting a war to notice that it was being rebuilt from the inside out. We are left to wonder how many other protocols are currently in effect, and whether we, too, would notice the gates before they hissed shut.